What's up guys, how's it going? Today we're gonna look at Glock trigger upgrades and we're gonna see what is the best trigger for the Glock. Is it the Alpha Competition Timney trigger or is it the Glock Performance trigger? So let's dive in, let's have a look. Okay, so first things first, let's have a look at what they actually look like. When we look at the Timney trigger, it has that nice, elegant, custom look. I love that little logo, that little T they put on it. It looks fantastic. So if you're somebody who likes to customize your pistols, this might be a great option for you. Timney trigger actually comes in an array of colors. You have red, purple, green, gold, bronze, and I don't know if there is any more, but that's a lot. On the other hand, we have Glock Performance trigger. You would not be able to tell a difference between the Glock Performance trigger and the Glock stock trigger. Glock is kind of like a Porsche of pistols. They stick with one design, they barely make any changes, they kind of go with what has worked for them for the whole entire time. They're not flashy, they're simple, they're boxy. So from the visual perspective, I think Timney trigger has one of the best looks available on the market for aftermarket triggers. It's simple, it's elegant, but it looks good and it gives you different options for colors. Okay, so let's look at something more important than the look. The feel, right? Like the most important thing about your trigger is how it actually feels in your hand, how it feels under your finger when you squeeze that trigger. With the Timney trigger, we have a very light take up, very light, very smooth. You find yourself at the wall right away. It feels marvelous. I love it. Then you have a break. It's a very crisp break. It's a light break and it's, I would say, almost metallic. When I used it the first time, I was almost getting surprised by it. It was so light, but it felt so good. Every single time I was like, whoa, did not expect it to go off just yet, but in a good way, if that makes any sense. On the other hand, we have the Glock Performance trigger. It is a Glock trigger. It's still going to feel like a Glock trigger. It's better than the original, but it's a Glock trigger. We all know that we don't really love Glock triggers and Glock sights. Every single person that I know that buys their Glock is looking to change the sights on the Glock and potentially change the trigger because it just doesn't feel great. The only reason someone would keep the original trigger on the Glock is one, they don't want to mess with the internals. Two, they don't want to pay somebody else to mess with the internals. Three, they believe that if they keep it stuck, it's gonna be the safest for their EDC, which makes sense. So going back to the feel, if I was to describe the pull of the trigger on the Glock, it's basically a bit of a longer take up. You still have that mushiness, you still have that little bit of a spongy feel, but as an opposed to the trigger that you get on the stock Glock, you do have a bit of a harder wall and you do get that more positive click, that harder break on that trigger. So you know exactly when your Glock is gonna go off. When we're gonna compare the two triggers, we also have to look at the price, right? The Glock Performance trigger costs about $100. Timney trigger costs about $200. So is Timney trigger twice as good as the Glock Performance trigger? In my humble opinion, yes. But there is a use for the Glock Performance trigger, and that's the reason why I have both of them. Before you decide on picking up one of these triggers, you have to ask yourself what you are going to use the pistol for. You heard me say that before, and it applies here as well. Timney trigger is not really known for being a concealed carry EDC trigger. Why? It's light, it can be considered more dangerous. Its mechanism actually is very different from the Glock Performance or the Glock stock trigger, which I'm going to tell you about in a second. On the other hand, people who will go with the Glock Performance trigger want an upgrade from the Glock stock trigger, but they want a better feel, they want a crisper break, they want slightly lighter take up, but at the same time they want to keep the Glock reliability and safety. They most likely want it for their EDC, for their everyday carry, their concealed weapon that they keep in the appendix pointed at their junk. Makes sense. The Timney trigger would be a trigger you'd want to put maybe on your competition pistol or maybe on your quote-unquote range toy. If I'm gonna be completely honest with you, I'm not that against Timney trigger as an EDC. I'm not saying it's preferred, but I'm not really against it. I'm gonna tell you why. First of all, if you're gonna have an everyday concealed carry pistol, you want to have a great holster for it. That's probably the second, or if not first, most important thing. You want to have a great holster. You want that trigger to be covered. You never want anything getting in the way of that trigger. So for that reason, it shouldn't be going off. You shouldn't have an incident while it's in your holster. Now, if you're gonna pull out your pistol and point at someone, yes, it's very light, it breaks easily, but you should never be taking out your pistol unless you're in a dangerous situation and you are about to use it. You should not use your pistol to intimidate anybody. You should not take it out for any other reason than last resort. This is it. This is the moment you've been avoiding and hoping would never happen, but it is happening and you have to use deadly force. That's when you take out your pistol from your holster. And at that moment, you are going to shoot. Having a trigger that you are warning is going to break too easily, or having a trigger that is too soft or too light, as soon as you point that pistol, it's going off if you're going to use it in a self-defense situation. Is it really that dangerous? If you follow all of the safety procedures, I don't think so. But if you are someone who is not very good at always remembering these things, you might want to have the safer option, which is the Glock Perfomance trigger. So now let's go back to the Glock Perfomance trigger and let's talk about what makes it safer and what makes it a better option for some people for everyday carry pistols. So the main difference between the Glock trigger and the Timney trigger, one is partially cocked and one is pre-cocked. It's also important to note this is why Timney trigger feels so amazing. Timney trigger is a pre-cocked trigger. Glock trigger is a partially cocked trigger. What does that mean? Well, it's kind of what the name indicates. The partially cocked trigger on the Glock does not have the trigger ready to pretty much go off at any second. There's still some distance the trigger has to travel to make the gun go off. With the Timney trigger, that trigger is pre-cocked and ready to shoot at the slightest pull of that trigger. So for that reason, a lot of people feel that the Glock trigger is safer. There is an additional mechanism that blocks the striker from hitting the primer. When your pistol is pre-cocked, that's not the case. There were some studies and some data and people reported the Timney trigger going off when dropped. Basically, Timney trigger is not drop safe. Now, I have tested it with my own model. As painful as it was, dropped my Glock with its beautiful compensator and trigger and all the bells and whistles. And I dropped it from about 6 feet. I am about 6'5", so I cannot imagine myself dropping my pistol from a height that's taller than my chest. The gun, in fact, did go off. So if you want to be extra safe, don't use it as an EDC and, try not to drop your pistol, really. Now, again, what makes the Glock Perfomance trigger safer? It is partially cocked, it's not pre-cocked, which gives it an additional wall of safety. When dropped from different heights, it did not go off. So if you're somebody who's gonna carry it around, carry the appendix, put it in your junk, you might feel better knowing that it's not gonna go off. Speaking about safety, it's important also to talk about the safety mechanism on the trigger. The Timney trigger has a very, very light safety mechanism. You could say it almost misses that wall that it's supposed to stop on. It's not really doing anything, but if I'm being honest, I don't really think it's the best safety mechanism. I don't really think it does a whole lot in general. The Glock Perfomance seems like it's a little bit longer. You can feel it catch on sometimes, but I don't really think it's a great mechanism in the first place. If you put some pressure on that trigger, it's gonna go off. But again, if you're super hyper focused on safety, Timney trigger has a very light safety on it and it's probably not gonna do anything. The Glock Perfomance trigger has a bit better safety pin on it. So to sum it up, if you're looking for a trigger for the range, where you can just shoot around, mess around, or you want to be a competition shooter, I have a nice light trigger for the competitions, not worrying so much about your EDC and your concealed carry weapon safety. Timney trigger is a great trigger. If you are somebody super experienced and you feel comfortable with a lighter trigger, you still might like it as your EDC. If you are somebody who does not like the regular Glock trigger, you want some improvement, but at the same time don't want to sacrifice the Glock safety and reliability, you might want to go with the Glock Perfomance trigger. So on that note, let me know what your preference is down in the comments. Let me know which one you like better. If you agree with my opinion or if you have a different opinion, totally fine. And until next time.